So remember that China is ruled, it is believed by the Chinese, by the family, the dynasty that has been chosen by heaven to govern. And so what happens is when we talk about Chinese history, we divide it up in terms of the family, the dynasty that rules China. So, for example, we're going to start this lecture talking about Ming Dynasty China, and you'll see the years there, 1368 to 1644. We'll then talk about Qing Dynasty China, right? Ming and then Qing. It's helpful. It goes in alphabetical order, M before Q. And what happens is when the Ming are overthrown and the Qing rise, you have a change in ruling family. And that's traditionally how Chinese people divided up their history, and we follow it because it's actually a pretty good way of defining the history. Things do change typically when the dynasty changes. So we're starting to talk about Ming Dynasty China, which was when one particular family ruled China. Then later on, we'll talk about Qing Dynasty China, which is the dynasty that took over after the Ming lost the mandate of heaven, and that mandate of heaven was transferred to a different family who would rule under the name of the Qing. And it's very important that you understand the difference between these two dynasties. Now, one thing that's fascinating about the early part of the Ming Dynasty China is its openness to the outside world, right? There was a man in this time period named Zheng He who would actually go out from Ming China around Southeast Asia, around India, to Arabia, and to Africa. Right, so there's this and the sense of going out. Now I want to emphasize this man Zheng He was not an explorer. He knew where he was going. The Chinese already knew where Africa was, where Arabia was, where India was, and all these other countries. They knew where they were. They were just laying out these large expeditions to go out to these different places. Now, the primary reason why they were going there was issues of tribute. So remember how I told you there was this idea among the Chinese that their emperor was special, and that there was only, in fact, one emperor in the world. Everyone else at best could be a king. Tribute is a gift you give someone who is above you, right? So, for example, kings would offer gifts to China, the emperor of China, and this was called tribute. And when someone offered you tribute, it meant that you were recognizing, or rather, it meant that they were recognizing that you were above them, that you were the emperor, that you were their overlord, right? The emperor of China does not pay tribute to anyone, but other people are expected to give tribute, to give gifts to the emperor of China. And so what Zheng He did was he went out to all these different countries, and he brought back gifts from those people. He brought some, and sometimes he brought the people back themselves to pay their respects to the Ming Emperor. And this was really a big deal because, imagine this, you're a Chinese person, you've never seen anyone from India before, you've never seen anyone from Africa before, and suddenly these people start coming to the Ming Emperor and start offering gifts, showing that they have accepted him as their overlord. Now, one thing I want to stress is one reason they were willing to do this was that they were given a lot of gifts back. They weren't considered tribute, but they were also given gifts back. And typically the gifts they received were higher in value than what they actually gave the Ming Emperor. That's why they were willing to do it. And also, they hoped that there would be trade and other things that would come with it. But the key thing here is, if you imagine you're a Chinese person, you've never seen an Indian, you've never seen an African, and these people come and offer tribute to your emperor, and sometimes this could be amazing things. So one thing that African people brought was a giraffe, and the Chinese, most Chinese had never seen a giraffe before, and it was actually close to a mythical creature in Chinese mythology in appearance, and that was believed that animal only showed up if you had a really good emperor, and here the Africans brought that animal. So if you were Chinese, this really impressed you. You said, "Oh, our emperor is awesome. All these people from all around the world are coming to offer respects to our emperor." But what I really want to emphasize here then, is that China in this early part of the Ming period is open to the outside world, is going out. It's not going out to explore, certainly not, but it is going out and visiting places, going to other countries and engaging in something like trade, right? They're bringing gifts back from these different countries, bringing people from these different countries, but they're also giving those gifts as well. And it does at times approximate trade. So this is a China that's very open to the outside world. And one thing we have to emphasize, this is a serious undertaking, right? You can see on this image, there is a picture of one of Christopher Columbus's ships, right? You may have heard the rhyme, in the year 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And of course, he had 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. For scale, we have his ship compared to one of Zheng He's ships. Look how small Columbus's ship is compared to the Chinese ship. And one thing I have to stress, remember, Columbus sailed with 3 ships. Zheng He usually sailed with several dozen ships, right? The number of people who traveled with Columbus could be measured in the hundreds. The number of sailors and passengers on Zheng He's ships could be measured in the tens of thousands. And my point here that I'm trying to make is this shows how wealthy and powerful China was. China was able to put together these expeditions with tens of thousands of people with dozens of these humongous ships. Had China wanted to, it could have gone out and explored, right? Had China wanted to, it could have gone out and explored. And just think about what the world might have looked like if it would not have been Europeans who quote unquote, discovered the New World. Imagine if the Chinese had got there first and set up colonies there, right? This would be a very different world that we live in. So the key thing I want to emphasize here, again, is that this shows that the Chinese were very wealthy, were very powerful, were interested in the outside world. And while they're not yet exploring, had they chosen to, they could have. And they could have projected an astounding amount of power. Like I said, tens of thousands of people were on these ships, and there were dozens of them. Now we know in retrospect that the expeditions of exploration carried out by the Europeans, as we'll talk about later, give them a lot of power, right? They allow them to colonize these new lands, to get the resources from those new lands, and that's going to make the Europeans fabulously wealthy and more powerful. I just showed that the Chinese had the ability to go out and explore had they chosen to. So the question then is, why did they stop? Why did they miss this opportunity? Right? Why did they miss this opportunity? Remember, a big part of this class is trying to understand why it was that the Europeans were so far behind the people in East Asia and the Islamic civilization, and then why they were able to catch up. So why is it that despite the fact that China has the technical ability to go out and explore, why do they stop? Well, first of all, remember, one of the key purposes of doing this was to obtain tribute, right? By getting gifts from people in Africa and India and Southeast Asia, the Chinese emperor was able to say, look, I'm awesome. All these people from all over the world are coming to offer me tribute, to recognize that I am their overlord and I'm just amazing. Once that was done, it didn't need to continue, right? Once that was complete, there was no need for it to continue. And you can kind of think about it this way, right? The Americans, we were in a space race with the Soviet Union to see who could put a man on the moon first. The Americans succeeded in 1969 with Neil Armstrong, and then we launched a few more expeditions, and then we stopped for several decades, right? We didn't need to keep doing it because we proved that we could, right? So once they got the tribute, once they got these people to recognize the power of the emperor, why continue? One thing I have to stress is that the Chinese tended to focus on the north, right? We'll talk more about this later, but the dynasty that replaces the Qing actually comes from the north. China had been conquered in the past by the Mongols. Those were people who came from the north. So whereas China, because it's on this gigantic continent of Asia, typically wasn't worried that much about the oceans. Stuff from the ocean wasn't very important. People from the ocean had never threatened them before. They tend to focus on the north because that's where dangers had come from the past, right? And if you're spending a bunch of money going on expeditions out on the ocean, you're not spending money on defenses to the north, such as building up the Great Wall. So the Chinese were very concerned about making sure that the north was protected. And a lot of Chinese said, okay, why keep spending all this huge amount of money on these expeditions, on these voyages? Remember, they're not voyages of exploration. But, why spend all this money getting political tribute when we did it and we've got other things to spend our money on? There was also this fear that by bringing in people from different countries, they would bring in barbarian influence. Remember, Chinese understood themselves as the center of the world, the center of the universe. Anyone who accepted Chinese culture could be seen as civilized, but if you didn't follow Chinese customs, they thought you were barbarian and you were dangerous, and your ideas might bring in negative influence, which could harm stability. And in future sections we will talk about, they actually had a point, right? When you bring in new ideas into a society, they can cause change, and that can be a threat to stability. In addition, whereas as we'll see, Europeans came to embrace trade as something good, Confucians thought trade was bad. They had a status system with officials on top, then peasants, then artisans, and merchants were at the bottom because merchants were seen as people who didn't really do anything to help a society. All they did was try and get you to pay prices for things that were, pay prices higher than what something was worth. Now, actually, merchants are very important because they move goods around and give people access to stuff they wouldn't otherwise have. But from the Confucian perspective, merchants were these dishonest people who got you to buy stuff that you didn't need for prices you couldn't afford. And there was a fear that if they had foreign trade, that would get people to waste money on foreign imports. They didn't understand how trade can produce wealth. But this made them oppose this idea of greater international trade and the like. Finally, there was also this feeling of self-sufficiency. Remember, China is like the size of Europe, right? So they were like, well, China has everything it needs. Why would we, spend money we don't have on something we don't really need that could bring in possibly dangerous ideas when we've got everything we need right here in China? So China will turn away from these voyages. It will stop them in the 15th century. It'll stop them in 1433. It stops with the death of Zheng He. And then that's the end of it. Right? So like I said, this is their first missed opportunity. They had the ability to go out to explore, but they chose not to. Now China would have another chance to get get ahead of things, to, for example, take advantage of the scientific revolution that Europeans were undertaking, right? Now, I call this the second missed opportunity because, spoiler alert, they're not going to take advantage of this, but we need to talk about how they were exposed to Western science, but then chose not to pursue it. So first of all, as we'll talk about in section 3, there will be this development of science in Europe. There will be a scientific revolution. And I'll talk more about what those terms mean specifically for this class. But for now, I just want to emphasize that the Europeans are starting to really move towards a modern scientific understanding of the world. Now, one thing I want us to understand in this class is that science and religion have a very complex relationship. Sometimes people will say things like, oh, science and religion don't get along or something like that. And as a historian who does a lot of work on religion, I would correct that by saying that some understandings of religion don't get along with science, but other understandings of religion do get along with science. And we'll give examples of both as we proceed in future sections. But for now, what's important to understand is that there were Europeans coming to China in the 16th and 17th centuries during the Ming Dynasty. One of the first was a man named Matteo Ricci. And that's him pictured on the left. And you can see he's not dressed as you might think that a traditional Western missionary might dress. He's doing this to show respect to Chinese culture and civilization. He really had a high respect for China. And so rather than trying to make the Chinese Europeans, he himself tried to become culturally Chinese while at the same trying to convert them to Christianity. Now, Matteo Ricci was a member of the Society of Jesus, what's often called the Jesuits. This is a Catholic missionary order. And he believed very firmly in, like I said, this idea of trying to not make the Chinese Europeans while at the same trying to convert them to Christianity. That's one of his converts to the right. And this missionary he was a part of, the Society of Jesus, also, like I said, known as the Jesuits, they believed very firmly that missionaries should know a lot of different stuff. They shouldn't just know about theology. They should also understand mathematics and astronomy and things like that. So, for example, not Matteo Ricci, but a different Jesuit missionary actually would make cannons for the Ming Dynasty. He actually knew how to make cannons, artillery pieces. And you may say, well, how does a missionary learn how to do that? The answer is simple. Cannons are similar to church bells in the way that you produce them. But the key thing is here is you've got this guy, Matteo Ricci, who's in China, who wants to convert the Chinese to Christianity, and he's going to try and do that not simply through talking to them about religion, but try and convert them using modern Western science. So not only will he, for example, write books on Christianity, on Christian doctrine, with the help of Chinese scholars such as the man there on the right, a man named Paul Zhu Guangqi, he will also, with his help, write books on Western astronomy and mathematics and things like that. So what's going on here is that Europeans are bringing their modern science to China, and many Chinese people were actually very interested in trying to come to a better understanding of this modern science because it did seem so very advanced. And while not, of course not, China's not going to convert to Christianity, there will be a sizable number of Chinese who do convert to Christianity, but for our purposes, what's more important is even more Chinese will come to an appreciation of Western science, which, like I said, focuses a lot on mathematics and astronomy. Now, you may say to yourself, well, what's the big deal about math and astronomy, right? How is that important? And I'm going to try and explain that. But first of all, from the perspective of the emperor of China, he's going to actually, and the other Chinese officials that serve him, will take the Jesuits fairly seriously. Not so much the Christianity part, but they will take it seriously, this new math and this astronomy they're bringing in. Because remember, it's very important to construct a calendar that will accurately predict comets and eclipses, right? Remember that the one way that the emperor, whether he's doing a good job or not, is whether he's able to predict those comets and eclipses, right? We talked about that earlier. And to do that means that you need to understand astronomy. So the emperor will, and the Chinese in general, will show an interest in mathematics and astronomy. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, you start off with astronomy, and to do well with astronomy, you need to develop math. But math is also used for engineering. And you can't build good machines without good engineering. And once you're able to produce good machines, then you can have the Industrial Revolution. And we will talk more about that later. Now, so it's key, right? The fact is that the Chinese are being introduced by these Jesuit missionaries to advanced math and astronomy. And if they get that down, in a sense, the sky's the limit. They could have also a scientific and industrial revolution, which, as we'll talk about later, would have made them very powerful. The problem is the Chinese Empire will just hire the Jesuits to do that work for them. They will also train some Chinese. But for the most part, they don't really take astronomy and math seriously in the sense of what it could lead to. They do take it seriously in the sense of building a calendar so they can predict comets and eclipses to show that they had the mandate of heaven, but they don't take it seriously in the sense of saying, hey, if we develop this stuff, how far can we go? So they will just hire the Jesuits and then some other Chinese who the Jesuits train in order to develop their calendar so they can predict comets and eclipses, and that's where it stays at. It doesn't progress beyond that. Why? Because remember, in the Confucian tradition, moral knowledge is more important than technical knowledge, right? So in a sense, the Chinese government was too practical, right? They didn't see what this could lead to. They said, oh, this is nice. This is interesting. This will help us to rule. But fundamentally, it's not that important, right? This technical knowledge of math and astronomy, it's useful. But true knowledge, real knowledge, the knowledge that people need to have in order to govern effectively is not this technical knowledge, it's moral knowledge. So because of all this, the Chinese will just kind of stay stuck in this time period, focusing on astronomy and math and not going beyond it. So they won't have a full-scale scientific revolution and all the advances that brings. And then you can't have you can't have an industrial revolution without a scientific revolution. So things just kind of stop there for the Chinese. So this can be kind of difficult to follow. So let me give you another illustrative example. right? So we've been talking about this missed opportunity. The first missed opportunity was that even though China had the ability, had they chosen to go out and explore, they could have gone around Africa to Europe. They could have gone east from China and discovered the Americas. They didn't, for the reasons already discussed. And then I emphasized how you have these missionaries like Matteo Ricci coming to China, bringing advanced science and math, right? But the Chinese are not going to pick up on that and on the scientific revolution. And I think it is kind of hard to grasp, why is math and astronomy so important? Well, the key thing is it leads to, like I said, the scientific revolution. That's kind of the basic blocks that you start with. And then that leads to things like the Industrial Revolution. And here's my example, I think, that really highlights that. So Matteo Ricci, when he was in China, he had a problem. He wanted to get the emperor's official approval to stay in China. And to do that, he had to prove that he was useful and interesting and that he wouldn't cause any problems. So he decided to give the emperor a clock to show that he was useful and interesting, and then therefore the emperor would want him to stay around. And the emperor was amazed by the clock, and you can see a replica of the clock on the left, right? And, even from our perspective, this is kind of cool, right? Look at all those gears and springs and everything that helps make that clock up. That's pretty cool. And it is neat because it's this thing that kind of works on its own, right? There's no person there directing it. You just wind it up and it goes and works on its own, moving around and with all this intricate movement and so forth. The emperor was really impressed by that and liked Matteo Ricci and did eventually give him approval to stay in China. But for the emperor, the clock just remained kind of a toy, right? Kind of froze there, kind of stopped there. Instead of saying, wow, I wonder what else we could use this technology for, it was just an expensive toy. Well, look on the right. That's an early steam engine. And you look at that and you look at the clock, they're kind of similar, right? They're using the same kind of mechanical gears. They're using the same kind of action, the same kind of movement. And the key thing is this, right? Europeans, they're at this early stage of science, and they're at this early stage of applying that science, what we call technology. They're making clocks, and clocks are cool. Clocks do neat things. But they're going to be able to run with that. They're going to be able to develop those clocks so they eventually get steam engines. And that will give them a huge amount of power, something we'll talk about later on in section 4. But it will give them a lot of power. But the Chinese just stay with the clock. It's just a neat toy for them. Whereas at this time period in the West, there's this realization that, hey, let's keep developing these things and who knows what we'll get. And eventually they get the steam engine. Now, in this section, I want to emphasize the importance of stability. And you can see this with the decline and eventual fall of the Ming Dynasty. Remember, in Chinese civilization, there's this understanding of a kind of dynastic cycle in which a dynasty, the ruling family, is chosen by heaven to rule. They do a good job for a while, and then eventually they're replaced by another dynasty once they start behaving in an immoral way. So what's going to happen to the poor Ming is they're going to lose stability, and that will lead them to be overthrown. First of all, starting in the late 16th century into the early 17th century, the Ming are going to be hit by a lot of natural disasters, such as famines, floods, heavy rains, that kind of thing. And that will then lead to food shortages, right? People will not get enough food to eat. That's a big problem throughout Chinese history. And usually when the dynasty is strong, when you have a powerful emperor, it's not a big deal because China's a huge place. There's people starving in the north. That's fine. Well, we've got extra food in the south. Let's move it up there. And that's typically what happened. The problem is, in the late Ming Dynasty, right, in the late 16th and early 17th century, there were lots of economic problems, and there was a growing problem of corruption. And that prevented the government from dealing with these problems. So you have a rise of instability. So then, if people can't get enough food to eat, what they're naturally going to start doing is trying to steal. There will be a rise of bandits. People will go around trying to steal food from anyone who has it. And as the government fails to deal with these bandits, and it can't because it has problems with economics and with corruption, the bandits will transform from being just bandits who want to steal to rebels who believe that the Ming has lost the mandate of heaven and that maybe they have it, and they're going to try and overthrow the Ming. And eventually what in fact happens is that a group of rebels do overthrow the Ming and declare their own dynasty. Now, that's just kind of typical what happens in Chinese history, but there's something else we have to emphasize here. And that was that the group that overthrew the Ming are themselves very quickly destroyed. If you look at this map, you'll see that there are 3 arrows. The arrow near Fujian in the southeast, it says pirates, right? China was being attacked by pirates during this time period. The Ming were not too interested in the pirates. I mean, they tried to fight them, but the pirates are just pirates. They steal stuff and they leave. They don't conquer the country. In the past, though, people from the north had tried to conquer the country, and that's why the Chinese were not so interested in continuing to support Zheng He's voyages. That's why there was a shift to a northern strategy, to saying, hey, we don't want to worry about these voyages. We need to build up the Great Wall, because people from the north, like the Mongols, might try and conquer us. And you can see them in the northwest, right? That's that arrow, the one to the left in the north. And they, in fact, had conquered China back in the 13th century. When the Ming Dynasty rose to power, they were the ones that overthrew and got rid of the Mongols. However, in this case, the Chinese group that overthrows the Ming are not defeated by the Mongols. They're defeated by the Manchus. You can see on the just up near Korea in the northeast, it says Jurchen, and in parentheses it says Manchus. Those people will come down, claim that they're avenging the Ming, and destroy the rebels. And they then will establish a new dynasty in China. And I want to stress, notice, they're coming from north of the Great Wall. These were people that the Chinese considered barbarians. And they're the ones who are going to establish a successful dynasty after the fall of the Ming Dynasty. So we talk about here the Manchu conquest of China and their establishment of the Qing Dynasty. So first of all, what I need to really emphasize here is that the Manchus are an ethnic group, right? The Manchus are an ethnic group. They were not traditionally believed to be Chinese. The Chinese, the people we're calling the Chinese, 95% of them or so would have called themselves Han, right? Han Chinese people generally followed Confucianism. They spoke a dialect of Chinese. They would write in Chinese. They had their own customs. They focused on agriculture. They were a different ethnic group than the Manchu. The Manchu had traditionally been more, they did some farming, but they tend to focus more on herding. They also had their own religion that was not Confucianism, that was different, focused on shamans, in fact. They had their own spoken and written language, which were not related to Chinese. Those were the people, these non-Chinese people, who come in and establish a new dynasty and call it the Qing Dynasty. So the thing was, a lot of Chinese people were not happy about this because they saw the Manchu, who were not ethnically Chinese, who spoke a different language, practiced different religion, very different people. They said, how could these barbarians possibly receive the mandate of heaven? Right? How could these barbarians possibly receive the mandate of heaven? And this is a very serious issue because if they weren't able, right, the Manchu Qing, remember Manchu is the ethnic group, Qing is the dynasty. That's the name we give to the dynasty ruling China during this time, which was ruled by Manchus. So the emperors of the dynastic family were all Manchus. How could these barbarians possibly have the mandate of heaven? And if the Chinese did not accept the Manchu emperors as the true emperors and did not accept the Qing dynasty as a legitimate dynasty, they would rebel against it, right? They would fight against it. So the Manchu had to figure out a way to convince the Han Chinese to accept them as having the mandate of heaven. And they obviously did this because if you look at the years, they last for a very long time, right? Just shy of 300 years. So they do succeed in doing this. And the way they convinced the Chinese that they have received the mandate of heaven is by accepting Confucianism. And the example I like to give is of this emperor right here, the Kangxi Emperor. That is an image of him, and I think it's fascinating because it maybe doesn't go along with what our image of an emperor might look like, right? When I think of an emperor, I think of someone wearing like fancy robes and having lots of jewels and a crown or something like that. But when we look at this picture, we see a very simple person, right? There's no jewels. The Kangxi Emperor is wearing a simple blue robe. And you'll notice that rather than having jewels or a scepter or a sword or anything like that, he has an open book. And behind him are books. And what this illustrates is how the Kangxi Emperor is going to accept Confucianism. He's going to say, okay, I believe in Confucianism. I'm going to respect Confucius. I respect the emphasis on scholarship that you find in Confucianism. I'm all for Confucianism. And this works. In a sense, by accepting Chinese civilization, Chinese culture, Chinese morality in the form of Confucianism, the Kangxi Emperor is able to convince the Chinese people to accept Manchu Qing rule. Right? This works, and they're able to continue their dynasty. They're able to continue ruling. And the fact that the Qing are able to win the support, or at least the acceptance of the Chinese, is going to allow them to continue their conquests. And this is one reason why China is the size it is today, right? You'll notice that the backslashed area, that's the Ming Dynasty China. The other territory, such as Manchuria, Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet, that is added to the Qing Empire later, right? The Qing, after they take over China, they bring stability there. They are going to expand their empire even further to include these other areas. And those areas, such as Xinjiang and Tibet and Manchuria, are going to be a part of China today, right? So it's in a part thanks to the Qing's ability to bring stability to these areas that allows them then to go out and make all these conquests. That's going to lead to China being the approximate shape it is today and being so large. Moreover, the stability brought by the Qing and the crops from the Americas, basically things like potatoes and other stuff we'll get from the Americas to China, is going to lead to population growth, increased trade, urbanization, and increased wealth. Right? So in the 18th century in China, they're going to enjoy kind of a golden age. Lots of people will have increasing wealth. They will have more cultural activities to spend that wealth on. So they'll be living, in a sense, better and happier lives. And you can see just how huge China is becoming. In 1390, China had a population about 70 to 80 million, but by late 1700, it was about 300 million. And in that time period, I want to emphasize population growth isn't a sign of a problem. We often connect that with problems today. In this time period, this is considered a good thing because more people means more people to work the land, right? So in this time period, because there's open land, because there's places that you can work even more intensely, more people doesn't mean less wealth. It actually means more wealth, right? So China is, like I said, is going to be this huge, highly developed culture and civilization, right, until even into the late 1700s.